I'm excited to be here. I'm Caroline Sinders. I'm a human rights researcher and artist. And the sort of main thrust of my work is how do you use intersectionality, which is intersectional feminism, as a way to sort of investigate and interrogate technology. I work a lot with journalists, community organizers, and activists across the world. I've been working a lot in the Western Balkans, where my husband Stjepan is from. So if any of you ever want to collaborate, let me know. I'm very open to that. I love writing grants and figuring out ways to work together. My human rights lab is called Convocation Research Plus Design. A lot of the work we're doing right now is doing applied research to privacy and technology and working with reproductive justice activists in the US. I'm from Louisiana, where very recently abortion has been banned. People have to drive up to 11 hours to a whole other state that's like in the middle of the country to be able to access any kind of reproductive care, which is quite frankly very awful. So one of the things I've been doing is working with activists down there to teach them basic privacy and security and to ensure that they can be safe. And so this kind of work is like very much a part of my my practice. It's also a part of my personal politics. And so, yeah, so today's lecture is really focusing on, again, the politics of technology, data collection, and data creation by recognizing blind spots bias and the objectivity of data. So overall, we're going to be talking a lot about examples of data, some different frameworks I use, and also just this sort of general idea of like, what is sort of the truthfulness of data and what is the context of data. But I always think it's good to start with something, even if it seems a little basic, of what is feminism. For me, I think of feminism as something that's very basic. It's gender equality for all genders, so not just women, but like all genders. And so that's also thinking about the ways in which, how are we allowed to express ourselves? How are we allowed to express emotion? What opportunities are given or available to us? How does the state interpret those opportunities? How does law facilitate those opportunities? How does culture impact those opportunities? But one of the things I also like to ask my students is, do we think that all feminism is equitable? So this is where maybe it's worth thinking about, at least in like a North American context, one of the ways feminism gets described is in waves. So like first wave feminism was the establishment of the suffragette movement in the United States, for example, so the early 1900s, with giving women like the right to vote. Second wave is sort of after that. Some of this can be just sort of mapped to like dates. So that is like in the 40s and 50s, sort of the rise of thinking about, like in the US, at least there was a rise of single mothers and women having to work, and with the understanding that women were not paid the same amount. Third wave sort of goes from like the 70s in a way almost to like the 80s or 90s. And then some would still say we're in the third wave, some would say we're in a fourth wave. So someone wrote, we cannot be equal as men already have all of it. And it's true. And this is where I think having men a part of the feminist movement is actually really important, being able to have those with more privilege to say, like, actually, like, this is, you know, fucked up, for lack of a better phrase, that like, that these opportunities have to be shared. And also someone else has written, intersectional feminism is trying to make feminism equitable. And I would agree. I'm speaking to all of you from the United Kingdom. This is a place where trans women are not seen as real women. So there's a rise of what some have called trans exclusionary radical feminism, or TERFs. My kind of intersectionality is one where trans women are women. And so a lot of like second and third wave feminism, as it was written, was talking about gender in a binary. And I think it's important to highlight that some of that is just due to how language was at the time, right? Like that there wasn't really a lot of visible trans women. A lot of older feminist text sort of creates this binary between men and women. And I actually do think that that's important when we place it in a historical context, right? Of thinking about, okay, the reason that that argument was structured in that way was because it was the 1950s. And like there wasn't the same knowledge we have now about the plurality of genders, for example. Wasn't the same knowledge we have now about like about what does it mean to be non-binary, but still femme presenting, right? And I think these are really important conversations. And so I always think it's important to talk about, is feminism equitable in a modern context? Because we have all different kinds of feminism. Especially in a modern context, we have things where there's like white feminists who are very concerned with their own specific community. So like white feminism in the US would be white feminists who only care about white US women, right? Or take a very, I think of it as a patronizing tone towards the rest of the world. So viewing the US as first world and everything else as not, which is not very equitable, and it's not intersectional. And I think it's also at times inappropriate to even call that feminism, right? But I think it's important to highlight that like the term feminism really gets like misused in a global context. And also then that impacts the local ways we talk about feminism. And so by understanding that this is a term that can be weaponized, it's important then to think about, well, what is our definition of feminism? So mine is one that is intersectional. It's understanding that all different aspects of our identity sort of map onto each other. And so that like I can't separate my identity as like a white woman who's bisexual from my feminism, right? And I can't separate that from my lived experience. So if someone were to ask me to like separate that, I'd be like, well, I can't. Like, how do I forget a part of myself, right? Just as I'm sure for all of y'all living in Central Europe or Central Asia, you can't separate your location from your identity, right? And so that's like a very important thing. And so for me, I think the most equitable form of feminism is intersectionality. And intersectionality, right, which we've talked about just a little bit, is this form of feminism that argues how all different aspects of identity, like gender, like race, like class, like sexuality, and like disability, that they overlap or intersect. This is just a graphic that I made of intersectionality. Feel free to like copy this. I'm not an amazing graphic designer. I'm like a brutalist UX designer, but it's just like a helpful thing to see. So all of these things sort of overlap with our identity, right? And so I think it's important that like we be constantly remembering that. And I think sort of related to what we were talking about earlier, so when I think about how do we make better technology, I think a lot of that does need to have intersectionality, like intersectional feminism within it. And I think it's the same way if we do any kind of quantitative or qualitative research, including data, either making data, analyzing data, generating data, et cetera. And so often what my students ask me, because I teach responsible technology, that's like the big thing I teach along with data visualization and feminism and like data feminism. So like in this big scheme of better tech, a lot of words get thrown around and used interchangeably, but they all mean different things. And they can all be used to make something that is responsible or that is equitable or that is ethical or feminist. And these are good things to aim for. Just because something says it's feminist, that doesn't mean it's actually ethical feminism, which would incorporate like justice and responsibility and ethics. And so this slide, I should just highlight, I'm using so like where it looks like exclamation point equals, that's used in technology to mean doesn't equal, by the way. So I'm saying like if feminism equals ethics, ethics doesn't necessarily equal feminism, depending upon the way you think about it. If we think ethics and responsibility are equal, does responsibility really equal ethics? And then what is responsibility? If it's transparency, does transparency really equal responsibility? This is where when people talk about open source, like as a form of accountability, is it those things? And so the reason I'm bringing this up is I think it's important for us to think about, well, what are the building blocks of all of those terms? So if let's say we were to form a company right now, and we were to engage in a form of, let's say, data analysis for a company, and we were like, oh, we should make everything open source because it'll be accountable. The thing I like to ask is, well, how will it be accountable? Accountable for who? Accountable in like what way? making things open source is fantastic. And I think that that is like a part of an accountable and transparent process. But I think it's worth thinking about who's our audience. If we make a data set open source, but we don't explain who we are or how we gathered that data, for example, or why we gathered that data, is it really accountable? Like, is it really transparent if we leave out all of that necessary information, right? And so and what makes our data set feminist? Open source can be a part of that. And the way we gathered that is also a part of it. But I think another part is, how do we allow for feedback? Like, how did we gather that data? How were we working? Were we working with a community? Were we upfront about who funded us, or like how we want to use the data later on? And I think all of those are a part of this deeper conversation. And so what I mean by that is, it's not enough to just say like, we're going to create a transparent feminist data set. I think we have to illustrate and show and evidence what is transparency and what is feminism, and like, why do they relate to each other? So the goal of this slide is more to say that, like, when we're thinking of describing our practices, I want us to really think about, how do we evidence that? How do we show that? And how do we talk about it? Versus just saying it's going to be responsible, it's going to be ethical, and it's going to be open source. Because open source, for example, gets us halfway there towards transparency and responsibility, but that alone is not enough to actually make something responsible. And so a feminist project, for example, may not necessarily mean a transparent project. There may be plenty of times where we actually say, actually, we shouldn't talk about explicitly how we found these users. It could really endanger them, right? An open source project may not be inherently feminist. We may actually decide, once we've gathered data, oh, like, this should not be open source. We need to be very careful about who has access to this data or how they're going to use it, right? And so I bring these up because, again, when we think about better tech, better for who, like what mechanisms, how are we explicitly making something feminist or equitable? And what are we making, and how are we making that a reality in our project? So part of data feminism is almost a roadmap to making or thinking about data creation with feminist values imbued in them. And this is one of the things I want us to reflect on. What makes a project, a data project, an art project, data collection, research, a community? What makes it feminist? What does it need to be a part of feminism? And what does it need to be equitable? If we were to take that and like almost operationalize it, one thing we could think of on a very practical level is like, how have we allowed for like diversity for those to participate? So in this case, a great way we're doing that is we are recording this so other people that cannot be here can participate. One thing that I'm going to do is, like, if anyone has any questions and you don't feel comfortable asking them here, you can email Alex and she'll forward them on to me. If we were to like truly make this equitable, I would be speaking not in English, but sadly I don't speak Georgian. So like, but you know, we could translate this right into a variety of languages. We could localize it to ensure that the language like sort of matches the norms of like conversational language. So like the ways that we can put these even into our data practices is ensuring, for example, if we were to do a survey, is it in a variety of languages, right? Like, is it in a variety of languages that people speak? Another thing can also be when we're describing technical processes, are we putting it in like simplified and plain language so people understand what it is we're asking them, right? And so like all of these things I think are important steps towards creating like feminist technology. So like this is kind of where I wonder when people make software and they say it's for like a global audience, but it's only accessible in English and on iOS, like is that really truly feminist, right? Like, is that a form of feminist technology? And then I will also then backtrack and say that like sometimes we can't make it as equitable as we'd like it to be because our funder didn't give us enough money, and you know, or like there was a variety of like other issues. But that's where I think it's also important to talk about those shortcomings or talk about like why, for example, something couldn't be achieved in a certain way, right? And I think it's actually fine to be like, oh yeah, they didn't give us the budget we requested, and so we had to choose between like Android and iOS, right? Or we had to like really prioritize like certain languages. And so I think like I always think it's important to think of like what we need to achieve, and then also related to that, how can we be honest about or upfront about our intentions and like why we couldn't achieve what we were aiming for. So moving on, I do think it's important to think about like how do we get our values and ideologies to match up with like what we're actually making. And this is where I think almost again like a checklist, I think it's worth really writing out explicitly like what makes a technology project feminist. And what does that mean for us? So it's not just like the values of the people that made it. It's like what languages the technology is accessible in, how are we like listing or talking about gender. I think like privacy and security are a big part of a feminist practice. So like if we're asking people to give us data, we have a duty of cause to protect that data. We need to ensure that like the data, our databases cannot be hacked, and that like the data we're asking for, if it were somehow to be leaked, that it wouldn't hurt anyone. And so that also then changes the questions we ask people in our projects, and also the things we ask people to do in our software, right? It really sort of changes that kind of interaction. As we were saying earlier, there's many different forms of feminism, and I like to sort of be really upfront. Feminism is complicated. Not all waves of feminism are equitable for today. As we mentioned earlier, some early feminism, like first and second wave, were very focused on a binary. Some even were more explicitly transphobic. And we see that persisting even right now, which is a shame. Like that's a form of discrimination. So intersectional feminism is an evolution, and I think a much needed correction of previous forms of feminism by insisting, rightfully so, that all aspects of identity be looked at. So I mentioned earlier, I'm a white bisexual woman. I have some hidden disabilities. I suffer from long COVID. I have ADHD. Long COVID makes it really hard for me to like physically do certain kinds of work. But as a white person, I have a lot of privilege. And as like a white person with a US passport, I have an incredible amount of privilege. And so my way of engaging with the world is going to be different than perhaps some of y'all's, or a white man's, or a Black woman, for example. But I think it's important to acknowledge those differences. So I want to bring up some different kinds of like manifestos and work that is on different forms of feminism. So glitch feminism was coined by the creator and writer Legacy Russell in 2013. And she was looking at the socio-technological construct of gender and sexuality. So she's looking at sociology and technology. And I'm going to read a little bit from her manifesto. Quote, "In a society that conditions the public to find discomfort or outright fear in the errors and malfunctions of our sociological cultural mechanics, illicitly and implicitly encouraging an ethos of don't rock the boat, a glitch becomes an apt metatonym. So glitch feminism embraces the causality of error and turns the roomy implication of a glitch on its ear by acknowledging that an error in the social system has already been disturbed by an economic, racial, social, sexual, and cultural stratification in this imperial wrecking ball of globalization. Processes that continue to enact violence on all bodies may not in fact be an error, but rather a much needed erratum. So the glitch is the correction in the machine, and in turn, a positive departure." So that's a lot of really big words, I will say. And a slightly more straightforward way to think about it is she's sort of talking about what does it mean to be a part of a glitch in a way when you are a part of a system that can't totally recognize you. I think she's also thinking a lot about how, like, while error states or mistakes can be an issue, how do we also allow for those errors to be celebrated in a way by recognizing that if a big system can't see something? What does it mean to be unseen? Or what does it mean to be in a system that hasn't made space for you, where it labels you as an error? So that's what she's thinking about. She's thinking about what does it mean to sort of exist beyond a binary. Missing data is a term actually created by a Black woman in the US named Mimi Anoha. And I love this project. Mimi was the year above me in my master's program. I love teaching this project because I think it's really related to glitch feminism and a form of feminism. And so I'm going to read a little bit about missing data sets. So missing data sets are blank spots in an otherwise data saturated space. The library of missing data sets, which you see here, is an ongoing physical repository of things that have been excluded in a society where so much else is collected. Unsurprisingly, this lack of data typically correlates with issues affecting those that are the most vulnerable. So the word missing is inherently normative. It implies both a lack and an ought, something that does not exist but should. That which should be somewhere is not in its expected place. An established system is disrupted by this absence. Just because some type of data doesn't exist doesn't mean it's missing. And so the idea of missing data sets is tied to a more expansive climate of inevitable and routine data collection. So why do missing data sets matter? And this is what Mimi also writes. I'm sorry, what I was reading above is also Mimi's writing, and now this next part is also Mimi's writing. That which we ignore reveals what we give our attention to. It's in these things we find cultural and colloquial hints of what is deemed important. Spots that we've left blank reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences, end quote. And so I think what Mimi's talking about is also a part of glitch feminism, that in a way we have to also sort of highlight and talk about the ways that systems are constructed and what systems choose to ignore and how they choose to ignore them. And so I think looking at glitch feminism in parallel with missing data sets is really important. And one of the things that this also leads us to talking about is like, when is missing data like helpful to a community or group of people? And when is missing data problematic or harmful? And that I think is kind of the issue sometimes when we talk about missing data, that perhaps we immediately run to the idea that all data sets themselves should be in existence. And I think that there are plenty of times where actually a data set may be missing to us, the general public, but it may actually exist for a community. So there's this really great group out of New Zealand, and they're documenting and recording the Maori language to make an AI model so they can help do Maori specific translations. They don't allow most companies or most people to actually have access to that data set or to that model. And so like they want to keep it Maori owned and just for the Maori. And so for them, they sort of refuse you multiple times at first. You have to kind of prove how do you want to work with this group, and how will you work with the Maori, and how will what you're doing actually positively impact the Maori people in New Zealand instead of just sort of like impacting your company's bottom line. So I think it is important to think about too, when also we make data, like who are we making it for, and how does the data set actually serve the people we want it to serve? And so this is also a way where we can acknowledge that some things that are missing may just be missing to us. They may not be missing to the community that needs it. And so a lot of the examples Mimi has, this is her art project. So it's a folder, it's a filing system that you can open, and you can see all different kinds of missing data sets. And so one says the number of mosques surveilled by the FBI. Like, us not knowing that is actually something we should know. We could help provide accountability to that surveillance, right? We could help try to fight that, or ask, like, why are you surveilling those particular religious areas? Another one is the case of the June 2015 Black church fires. So in the US in June 2015, quite a few churches, Black churches in the US, were lit on fire, and no one knows who did them. And I think these are the ones that really sort of highlight, what does it mean that we don't know that, in a way that highlights the bias, right? Like what does that, like it shows us what we do not prioritize, right? But I do think that there are some things we don't need. Like, I don't know if we need location specific, like real-time data on all of my activities, right? Like, I wouldn't like that, and I wouldn't like it if other people had access to it. And that could have all kinds of harmful ramifications for me. Like if I had a stalker, for example, and someone got access to that. And so what I like about missing data is she's doing, again, two things at once. She's trying to highlight the issues when data doesn't exist, and then the positives, the activism of when we can say, like, no, actually this data set or this kind of data collection should not happen. And I like that this project sort of very beautifully does both. So we're going to jump into this one called the Cyborg Manifesto because it gets mentioned slightly later in our data feminism work. So Cyborg Manifesto is written by Donna Haraway and published in 1985 in the Socialist Review in the US. That's a review paper. And so in it, the concept of the cyborg is presented as a rejection of rigid boundaries, notably those that separate human from animal and human from machine. And so Haraway writes, quote, "The cyborg does not dream of community on the model of the organic family, this time without the Oedipal project. The cyborg would not recognize the Garden of Eden. It is not made of mud and cannot return to dreaming. It cannot dream of returning to dust," end quote. And so this manifesto criticizes traditional notions of feminism, particularly feminist focuses on identity politics, and instead encourages coalition through affinity. So she's using the figure of the cyborg to urge feminists to move beyond the limitations of traditional gender, feminism, and politics. And so this manifesto is considered one of the milestones in thinking about feminist post-human theory. And I think it's also a good one to start as an introduction to even though it doesn't mention the plurality of genders in the paper, it's a good one to think about too, how why feminism needs to be extended beyond a binary of gender, and also how a feminist practice can include things like in a way the rights or the caretaking of animals, which is now an issue with climate change. So in a way, the Cyborg Manifesto would also, if it were to be published now, it would probably be talking a lot about the rights of the environment and how that is also like a feminist issue, which I would agree with. And this piece is really innovative in terms of examining a cultural divide. So she introduces the potential for this new way to sort of categorize nature and culture by looking at this combination of machines and organisms, which creates the cyborg. And again, so this use of the cyborg is her way of trying to examine these dichotomies, like what's the difference between nature and culture, mind and the body, and idealism and materialism. And so her use of the cyborg is blending imagination and material reality. The cyborg is supposed to be two things combined as opposed to two things separated. So there's a value in looking at the blending of borders of categories, which is something we talked about in intersectionality. And so like this, so this is why I like this idea of the cyborg was really important when this paper was introduced. And so I'm just trying to see, like, I'm just reading more about what I could read out loud. I think for the sake of time, we'll sort of go on because this gets very, very technical and it's very, very theoretical. But what I also like is her way sort of indirectly critiques white feminism by highlighting the struggles of women of color. So she suggests that a woman of color might be understood as a cyborg identity, this sort of potent subjectivity synthesized from fusions of outsider identities and the complex sort of political historical layerings of her biomythography. And I think what she's saying here more is that, like, because the point of the Cyborg Manifesto, right, is to blend separations and understand them as one, i.e. like gender and race would be a part of that, or like gender and disability. And that like those that have multiple identities are similar to like the cyborg she's talking about. And I'm curious, like when y'all think of like feminist technology, what comes to mind for you? If it's helpful, I'll just show y'all a few of what comes to mind for me. I think of like birth control as a feminist technology. I think of gender forming hormone care that trans people will take as a form of feminist technology. I think of this app called Block Party that's designed to help block trolls and combat harassment, also as a form of feminist technology. And I think we can also think of technology beyond just code and software, right? Because again, birth control is an invention, and the IUD is like mechanical technology that works extremely well, right? And so then switching gears to cover what is one of the main parts of this lecture is data feminism. And so data feminism is like a framework and theory and a series of writings that was created by academics and activists Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignacio. And so it pulls from this history of academic research that they have of reanalyzing the social sciences, technology, and data through a feminist lens. It has 6 principles, and there's a book and a paper. The paper is academic, but the book has a lot of examples and illustrations and is online for free. So one thing I will say is that like the book and the academic paper are very similar. The essay is very, very academic. What's really important is the academic paper, which we go into here, has 6 principles, but the book has 7, but they're very, very similar. So they just took one of the principles in the paper and split it into 2. And so it's just important to know that like their work comes out of this deep analysis and work of researching, of mapping social science and technology, of relooking at spaces to critique them with this feminist lens. And so these are the 6 principles from their book. And so one is rethinking binaries and hierarchies. And part of that one is they're both referencing code, how computer code is written on binary from 0 and 1, and gender, how Western culture has sort of repeatedly emphasized that there's 2 genders when there's actually like many, many genders. So yeah, so rethinking binaries and hierarchies, elevating emotion and embodiment, embracing pluralism, considering context, legitimizing embodiment and affect, and making labor visible. And so as I said earlier, like what do we think these are? It's C, all of the above, right? Rethinking binaries is referring to this. This is one of the things I like to show my students, which is like, would this be in data collection a rethinking of a binary? And I would say no, because there are like many, many other genders. And so we could include quite a few other examples in this. And so this is perhaps, I think, a better way to think about how we would want to collect this inside of like a survey or inside of like qualitative interviews. One thing we can think about is, do we really need a gender section? And sometimes we do. Like sometimes it is incredibly important to be like, who answered this survey, right? And like what are the concerns? Like how do cis men differ from like women and non-binary? That is at times incredibly important. But what I think is also important, so then if we're going to ask what people's gender are, this is a good way to do this. So women, man, non-binary, prefer to self-describe, or prefer not to say. So in a lot of the papers I've read, primarily one by Pew Research, which is this really large research organization in the US, they wrote about how letting people write in genders is really helpful and inclusive because you're letting people decide how they would like to be labeled. And I think that is incredibly important. And so like in rethinking binaries, Klein and D'Ignacio are challenging our notions of how we as data practitioners classify and why we think we need something as data and when perhaps we don't. So right in principle 1, rethinking binaries, this can be looking at gender, countries and regions, or other classifications. And so it's kind of encouraging us to think about, well, what are all the ways to describe an area, right? If we sort of, now that we know that we want to include, let's say like this for gender, not just man and women, but all these other ways, then I think it's worth thinking about what are the political ways in which we describe a country or a region, and are we describing it accurately and accurately for those that live there, right? And part of this is thinking about, well, how do we communicate the limitations of our categories in the final representation? Like how can we allow the user to refactor the categories we have presented? Some of that means, like, in some cases, it can be better to actually have users write in or classify what it is they think and feel versus having us create those selections for them. So that's why in this example, like having people self-describe is actually a more feminist way to have them select gender. And again, I'd recommend you can do a combination. It really depends upon the context of what you're asking, for example, but like for gender, having, man, women, non-binary, trans women, trans man, for example, having people self-describe, like those are really good ways. Like having the combination of choices and also a write-in is a good way to allow users to one to structure responses in a way that do make it easier for analysis, but then to allow us to acknowledge that we may be forgetting a classification or a drop down. The UK, for example, and the survey only covered men and women. Could you find another resource from like a reputable NGO or a CSO, right? Or a university that talks about, actually there is also this like entire group of people that classify as non-binary in this country, like in the UK. So like, while we're using this source, it's important to highlight the like non-binary folks are not represented in it. So we're like, so they may or may not be represented at all in the entire like data set. So that's a way that you could acknowledge that. One thing I'll say is that obviously not all data sets have data feminism within them, but what is important, again, is how we choose to talk about or contextualize the shortcomings of the data we're working with. So there's plenty of times where I've done a lot of data collection. Like I worked on a project with Project Include, and we had over 3,000 respondents to it, but we didn't have that many like Black women of color and Black non-binary folks and Indigenous populations fill out the survey. And so that's one thing that we just acknowledged a lot in the report was like, while we like tried to recruit for participants to take the survey, it still wasn't as diverse as we would like it to be. And so thus like, we can't necessarily speak to like all of the kinds of harm that people were experiencing in the workplace, just because of like how like who filled out the survey, for example. And so I think it is fine to acknowledge that. And so embracing pluralism is, this refers to Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which we just talked about. But like this is suggesting that we encourage openness. So pluralism is multiple viewpoints, and it's acknowledging many different facets. So by avoiding the view from nowhere, it's asking us to, in one hand, sort of embrace the fact that like our data can be and should be used by a variety of people, but how do we also be specific in talking about how we are like creating that data or where it came from? Meaning the view from nowhere is something where it's like, oh, well, this data just appeared, and it's not sort of talking about how it was funded or like who worked on it and where they're located. So it's kind of asking us, one, to think about the fact that there's many different people will access or look at our data from many different countries. And so how can we ensure that the data set or the data project allows for that? And how can we also sort of acknowledge, like, again, the shortcomings of the data, like what is missing, and also like what kind of point of view the data has. So yeah, so how can we, and this is where I think data visualization maybe versus data collection can be really helpful with that, right? Of like, how do we sort of show or elevate what's in the data while also acknowledging maybe smaller aspects of the data set itself, things that are points of view we do see missing. And related to that is examining power and aspiring empowerment. So this is where I think it's important to think about how we gather the data and who we've gathered it from. So that's acknowledging that like the creating a data set, which is knowledge, is shared, and that it's important to also ensure that this can work with a community, and that's representing the scale of the community. And what that means is like all the things a community is experiencing rather than just very individualized users. And so on a visualization standpoint, I think that's thinking a lot about, well, with what we're visualizing, how does this help or empower the end user, the community, the group, or the organization? And also thinking about, again, like, why did we gather this data, and how can it be useful, again, to these users we're trying to help? So it's really like also recentering the user's needs, and not just our needs, not just why we decided to gather the data, but also how does the community need this data? The next principle is considering context. And so that's just very straightforward what it sounds like. Local context and certain kinds of nuances get lost when we homogenize data. So this is really thinking about, with data visualization, for example, instead of just sort of showing really large groupings of findings, how do we break those groupings apart and add in more context? That could be age, race, and gender. That could be comparing how all different kinds of genders responded with race. Again, in this project I worked on with Project Include, when we looked at like remote workplace harassment during COVID, when we just looked at it as a binary of men and women, it looked like harassment had gone down. Or sorry, overall, when we first looked at it, it looked like harassment had gone down. But when we separated out men, and then we separated like white women, Black women, Indigenous women, mixed race women, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and then like trans women, we saw that like harassment had gone up for everyone, but it had gone up the most for like Black women, and then also like trans people. And so that was like a way for us to actually be like, oh, like how, like, what are all the nuances inside of this analysis we've done? And so like that was kind of our way of thinking about like, how do we visualize this messy data, if you will? How do we take into context, right, what we're looking at, and how can visualization be helpful for that? And so we actually showed in our paper, like at first it looked like it had gone down by just showing this rough breakdown, but then by saying when we dug in deeper, and we also then started looking at people that were on visas and people that were not, we saw all this more nuance like in our data set, for example. And so this is, again, also very rooted to visualization, but like we're getting to the point where it's like, well, how do we help the visualization do something? And that's where we can think of legitimizing embodiment and affect, for example. So knowing that experiences, right, derive from emotion and sensation, how can we think about what is the best way to show the data? Sometimes it may actually be a very straightforward graph, but it may also be something really creative or experimental. That could be sound, for example, is, depending upon what it is you're showing, is the best way to use sound, maybe instead of just color or size or scale, right? Maybe it's thinking about, is the best way to show something actually to make the data physical, right? Or is it to do like a very specific series of visualizations that relate to each other? Maybe it's not one visualization, maybe it's like 7, right? Maybe it's really showing all of these sort of nuanced things and understanding maybe you need 7 pages, right? And 7 graphs versus just 1. And this is the last step, which is making labor visible. And so Klein and Ignacio say it best in their paper that information design processes often start with data, but a feminist approach would actually insist that we start backwards to surface the actors, both individual and institutional, that have labored to generate a data set. So starting with questions of data provenance, like where does the data come from and who made it? helps credit the bodies that make the visualization possible. So the bodies that collect the data, that digitize them, that clean them, and that maintain them. So a feminist approach to data visualization can help render visible the bodies that shape and care for data at every stage of the process. And this relates to the concept of Provence rhetoric, in which authors of narrative visualization cite data sources and methods, which can help build credibility with the audience. But I also think showing labor is a point of accountability and transparency, of really listing out like who worked on the project. And so I know, for example, in some NGOs, people are not supposed to like be listed as authors, but I think it's important to show how many people worked on a project, particularly when we are, again, trying to make labor visible. I think it's important to show how many people worked on it and where they're from and what they're thinking. That is a form of accountability and transparency. So let's go through the data ethics canvas, and then I think we can talk a little bit about, well, if you're interested, we can talk about data subjectivity, but that's like usually more interesting for students. But anyway, let's talk about this canvas. I love this canvas. It was created by the Open Data Institute, started by Tim Berners-Lee here in the UK. I think it's a really, really helpful, like almost a little checklist to go through. I know that this is probably really small on your screen, so I'm going to try to read them out. So it's a checklist to think about for a data practice, and for like effectively if you're doing a report or an article or a visualization, that you should probably include all of this. So data sources, name and describe your project's key data sources, whether you're collecting the data yourself or accessing it via third parties. And then an important question to ask or think about, is there any personal data involved or data that is otherwise sensitive? So in the UK, if you were publishing stuff, you would need to redact some personal data, or at least make sure you're in compliance with data protection, right? If we're asking people for certain stories, or like, so because I work so much with online harassment data, I often end up collecting people's experiences of harassment. When I publish that, I have to really make sure that the person has consented to, like in our survey, to things being published, that I anyway should redact personal information, even if they've consented to it being shared, to ensure that I don't restart a harassment case, for example, right? It's really important to ensure that people are safe, and also that when I'm doing this work, that they've entrusted me to tell their story correctly, and that I'm also thinking through of like these downstream effects. So even just thinking very basically of like, okay, what data am I collecting? Like what's inside of this data set and what's sensitive that would need to be removed is really important. As I mentioned earlier, we were talking about regulation with personal data, like rights around data sources are really important. So if you aren't generating your own data, it's obviously really worth thinking about, okay, well, where did the data come from? Who is it produced by? Is it produced by an organization, or did you collect directly from individuals? Was the data collected for this project or another purpose? Like, do you have permission to use the data, or is there another basis on which you're allowed to use it? And what are the ongoing rights that the data source will have? And these, I just think, are really important to constantly consider and think about in a data practice of, well, where does the data set come from? And am I actually allowed to use it in this way? And then limitations in the data sources also. So what are the limitations? I think it's always good to sit down and really write that out. So as I mentioned earlier in my project with Project Include, our limitations were that we felt like our survey respondents were not diverse enough. And so we tried to be really upfront about that. So like that was us acknowledging the gaps or omission in the data, right? ODI recommends to consider bias in data collection, inclusion and exclusion in analysis. If you're using any kind of algorithms, what issues that arises, gaps or omissions in data, the provenance and data quality. So where does the data come from and the quality itself of the data? That can mean like, are you using an out of date data set? Is it something that was gathered under really faulty means? So like, you know, did you end up using a data set that like a student gathered in one day with just like 40 people that they know? That's probably not a really great data source to use, right? And then other issues affecting like decisions, like such as who worked on the team. again, we mentioned earlier, like regulation. And so this is ethical and legislative context. So are there existing ethical codes in your sector or project? So that's thinking like, are you working with health data? But that is really related to like, what is the legislation, regulations, or policies that shape how you use the data? What requirements do those introduce? So like if you're working across different countries, it is really worth looking into, okay, like what are the laws on like data collection, right? And so that's where they say, consider the rule of law. It's important to think about human rights and data protection, IP and database rights, anti-discrimination law and data sharing, policies, regulations, and ethics codes and frameworks. And so again, like, if you're not sharing a data set, some of this probably doesn't apply to you, but it is important to think about as you're gathering the data and you store it, depending upon where you gathered it from, you are beholden to those laws. And then ongoing implementation. So are you really routinely building in thoughts, ideas, and considerations of how people are affected by your project and how? That could be having a series of meetings throughout the project. That could be returning to these series of questions and really asking like, are we asking the right questions? Is this having an impact on our audience? What are we finding? Like really thinking about the impact of the project in general. And then is there information or training that might be needed to help people understand like data issues? That's for your internal team. Are there systems and processes and resources available for responding to data issues that arise in the long term? And again, that may not be like directly related to you, but I think by having this on a checklist, it's worth asking and just out loud saying like, oh, like, are we going to have data issues? Well, no, we're only working in this country with these respondents. We aren't sharing the data and we're only sharing the findings. But just using this as a checklist is a great way to be like, oh yeah, no, like that doesn't apply to us. And we know it for like this, and this reason. And again, this is a lot of stuff that I've said before, but I think it's just really important to use this as a checklist, like as a team, to ask your whole team or all of your collaborators, what is our primary reason for collecting this data and using the data in this project? What are our main use cases? Like, how do we know? What is our business model, if that's applicable to us? So it says, this one says, are you making things better for society? How and for whom? And I think that that's really, really important. And then like, what does better mean in that context? And then they sort of say like, are you replacing another product or service as a result of this project? And to think of the downstream effects, which I also think is a really smart question. And then they want us to think about the positive effects on people. So, who is going to be positively affected by this and how? And this is encouraging to list it out, like which individuals, which groups, which demographics or organizations. And then how are we measuring in community positive impact? Could it be increased? Should we increase it? And then relatedly, they have one on like negative impacts on people. So who could be negatively impacted by this project? Could the way the data is collected, used, or shared cause harm or expose individuals of risks of being re-identified, or could it cause other harms, right? Could it be used to target, profile, or prejudice people or unfairly restrict access? So it's also worth thinking about when you're reporting on stuff too, like what are the ways in which, even if it's truthful in the data, to think about how are we writing about this? How are we contextualizing it? Like if there's a negative impact, can we at all help mitigate the harm that will come out of like our negative findings? And then again, are the limitations and risks communicated to people that are filling this out? And then, this leads into the next one of like, how could we minimize or mitigate this harm? How can we reduce limitations in our data sources? And then how are we keeping personal and sensitive information secure? And how are we measuring, reporting, and acting on potential negative impacts of our project? And then what are the benefits of these actions? And then also thinking about reviews and iterations. What is our data ethics standard? And how will arising issues be like monitored and discussed? And like what actions will we take? And how often will our responses be reviewed or updated? And like, what does that sort of mean? Lastly, we have engaging and communicating with people. So how are we engaging with, how can people engage with us throughout the project? We're working with a particular group, like what's the cadence of working with them? once we publish something, like how can people correct information or request changes? Is it possible? And how can we make it possible? Like what is our working through that? And then are the appeal mechanisms like reasonable and well understood? Meaning like when changes are happening, do people understand like how we're going to create that change? And are they things we can actually do? Are they things that can be implemented in the long run as well? So like, for example, with the paper I wrote with Project Include, like that is owned and housed by Project Include. I think that they can make some updates, but I think after probably, now it's been out for like almost 3 years, they probably aren't updating that paper because it's now an old paper, right? But anyway, for the sake of time, I'm going to wrap up in like a minute or two. But I think it's important, these next few ones of like, how are we communicating our purpose, right? And how are we approaching openness and transparency? So do people understand like why we're doing the project, especially people that that the data is about or who are impacted by the data? And like really reflecting on, well, how have we been communicating like why we're doing this? How has the communication been clear? How could it be improved to be made more clear? And again, how are we ensuring that vulnerable individuals or groups understand that, like understand what it is we're doing? And that really comes back to how are you engaging with all different kinds of groups? And that is, related to openness and transparency, right? So, are we publishing our methodology, our metadata, data sets, code, or impact measurements? And so in some cases, you may not want to publish the data set, right? But maybe publishing your methodology and how you gather the data, that's a form of openness, right? Are we asking peers for feedback on the project? I often ask for like many people to review findings and like read off on a paper before I publish it. Since in civil society, we don't do peer-reviewed work, but effectively I ask my peers to sort of read and like flag any questions they see. And then, and then I try, and so they're asking like, if you're using the data ethics canvas, will you publish all the answers to the canvas? And I think that that's actually great. Like, maybe in our projects, we should do this, right? Like maybe in my next project, we'll like publish our internal data canvas so other people can see it. I'll say in some cases, maybe you can't, like maybe there's too much sensitive information, but being able to at least take some of these points and maybe put them in your, like put them somewhere in your project. That could be on the project website page, that could be in a paper of just saying like, here's our methodology, here's how we try to ensure fairness. Here's like the things we looked at to guide us, like the ODI data ethics canvas, like data feminism, like a digital rights framework. I think all of those are really important. And then, so yeah, sharing data with others. Are you going to be sharing it with other organizations? If who, and are you planning to publish any of the data under what conditions? Often when I'm engaging with people, especially, so I try to make it very clear in our surveys that we are going to publish the material, but we aren't going to share the data, like the data set with other organizations unless they're already collaborating with us. And when I do qualitative interviews, I'm very clear that no one has access to the recorded interviews other than myself and the transcriber, and that like I will share quotes that are anonymized with our internal team, or I'll share quotes that can be tied to someone's name if they've given me explicit consent. And I'm very, very clear about that, like in the very beginning when I interview someone before we, I record that, but I also like, before I even start the interview while I'm recording, I will say all of this, and then all the interviewees really get a choice. Do you want to be used by your name? Do you want to be anonymous? Do you want approval over the quotes, for example? In some cases, we can provide that. In other cases, we can't. And then we also engage in what's called transparent opacity, in which that I will take your quote and I will describe what it is you're saying, and I will redact any personal information. So if someone said they worked at a university, I would say that they work at like an educational space, like a school, but I won't say, let's say a university, or I'll say like a higher education space, for example. And so this is a way to remove information about the person, including like the linguistic structure of how they speak, to really try to remove all different identifying aspects. The last thing is your actions. What action will you take before moving forward with the project? And they're saying like, will you publish your actions to this canvas? I think our actions are also like, what are we doing to ensure the data? And what do we do with the data after the project? And are we disclosing that to everyone? So when the project is done, what are we going to do? How are we still shepherding the project? What have we done beforehand and during to ensure that this has been like as safe and equitable as possible? That is my lecture. Thank you for having me.